So welcome everyone to poetryEast, to our special Irish night at poetryEast. I'm really delighted that we can do this special evening tonight. We've got three wonderful Irish poets coming to read for us, all published with the Gallery Press, wonderful press, that their books are very beautiful indeed. So we're going to start with Vona Groarke. So I thought what we'd do, Vona, hi there, hello. Where are you tuning in from?
From Manchester.
You're from Manchester, I remember.
Up the road.
Yeah, so really lovely to see you. Thank you very much for coming. Here I am, my name's Maitreyabandhu. This is the main shrine room of the London Buddhist Centre. And this is the home of poetryEast. So welcome, Vona. So I thought rather than me kind of introduce you to everybody, I thought the best way to introduce you is for you to read a poem. And you've chosen a poem that I asked you to sort of think of a poem that you might particularly want to bring to us at the start. So why don't we start with reading that poem, then I'll ask you a little bit about why you've chosen it.
Okay. It's The Old Country from my collection Double Negative, which came out last year. The Old Country. I'll start again. The Old Country. I came out of that country with one suitcase crammed with newspaper, seeds in every fold. No, that's not it. No seeds and no newspaper. My suitcase was full of snow and the shadow of snow, which is another way of saying it was full of lies. I had been there for years, whole months of them, and then, just like that, words stopped calling on me, street signs flipped inside out, my neighbours swapped faces, the blue door was, by nightfall, paler blue. On clean days, hail pockmarked the pillows. I try not to picture it, or to calculate heartbeats, blood I bled, rooms undressed, ways of waking up, ounces in an ounce of love. I am scattering ink-white ashes as I write. Sometimes you live a day, so it passes through you like a ghost on the landing. And sometimes I think there is no landing, and the ghost cannot be me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So say a little bit about why you particularly chose that poem to introduce yourself, as it were.
Well, the collection Double Negative is concerned, well, with a number of topics, but one of the themes that it's concerned about is the theme of aging. And the words middle age crop up quite a bit, which are words, I think, to repel almost every possible reader. But of course, therefore, they attracted me. So I decided that I would try and work with this idea of what it is to write middle age into poetry. But it's not so much the theme that is of interest to me, but one of the other things that I was trying to do in the collection was to disrupt the straight line procedure of the lyric poem. I didn't want a poem that started in a place, that accrued illustrative detail, that understood what it was doing, and that ended in a safe place that could be predicted and that would deliver the reader into a place where all was known and understood. So that's what I definitely didn't want to do. So I was trying to write poems, and I think for the most part, the poems in the collection are poems that disrupt that lyric narrative line, that maybe start several times in different places, or that contradict themselves, or that falter and allow themselves to falter and don't try and correct that falter, and that end not with any kind of narrative resolution, but that end perhaps with an image, and an image that isn't predicted by anything that comes before it. So that, in other words, there's a big right angle swerve at some point in most of the poems that are in this collection. And it's that swerve that I was really interested in with these poems. How could I get the poem to end up in a place that was really very different from the place you might anticipate from the start of the poem? So that's what I was working with. And this poem seems to me to be one that does that. In that the image of the ghost on the landing isn't pre-shadows or foreshadowed in any way, I think, by anything else that happens in the poem, but isn't, I think, entirely out of order, or it doesn't clash, but it's not a logical follow through either. So that it's the difference between match and mismatch that I was interested in, and that's why I picked this poem.
It's striking to me because, well, it's that ghost at the end, and then the snow in the suitcase. There's some kind of relationship there, but not, as you say, not an obvious one. The other thing, one of the many things I was struck by reading Double Negative is you and form, what you're trying to do with form in this collection. I hadn't thought of it how you're putting it, but there is a sense of a relationship to form and a kind of disrupting of form.
Yeah, I think that's right. I wanted to undercut my own authority in the poem in a way. Now that sounds very grandiose, but I think there is a way of writing a lyric poem where you seem as though you're in possession of the material right from the get-go. And that's not the poem that I wanted to write in this book. I wanted to write a poem, to write all of these poems as though the material, the subject matter emerged. Rather than, everything fitted neatly against that. So yes, the form is there, and the form breaks down in places. You might have a stanzaic pattern, and then that might be completely disrupted, which I like doing too. And the tone might be shifted around a little bit, not hugely. I think the tone is probably the one thing that runs reasonably constantly throughout the book, but in terms of form, in terms of subject matter, and in terms of just approach to the subject matter, I do try and have a bit of humor in the book as well. There's a few jokes. Well, jokes. They're not, but they're not deadly in earnest. Let's put it that way. Maybe that's better than calling them jokes. But they're phrases or propositions in the poems that are not deadly in earnest. And also they're poems that use imagery as a way of getting out of a poem, or as a way of just slipping slyly away without having to have the kind of the big denouement. The answer is not at the end of the poem. So that's one of the other reasons I picked this poem, was because there's something about that suitcase that really appeals to me. This suitcase that is, of course, I suppose, a kind of a poem-shaped object. The suitcase that you can cram everything in, and those things don't have to be logical, obvious, literal things. They can be all sorts of oddities and bits and bobs and things that don't belong there at all, and yet somehow just by putting them in, you make them belong. And I really like that way of letting material be both very surprising, but also not I'm not saying that it's very conflicting. I think I like things to be mannerly in terms of the poems. I don't want them to be shouting at a reader, and I don't want them to be so oblique that the reader can't get near them at all. I don't want my poems or what's in them to refuse the reader, but neither do I want them to make it too easy for the reader.
I mean, that's what I liked about the collection very much, and it is this sense of, I didn't feel like you were trying to improve me. I really dislike poems that have got, trying to improve me. I mean, I need improving, don't get me wrong, but God, good heavens, I need improving. But I don't like it from poetry, but also I don't like obscurity for its own sake. And I thought you were sort of very carefully inviting me in, but not making me feel too at home in a certain sense. At home enough. I don't know whether that chimes for you.
Well, I'm glad to hear it, and I'm glad you didn't feel improved by my poems. I certainly wouldn't be the person to take on such a task. In fact, one of the poems, this poem finishes with the phrase, "This poem has no designs on you," which is something as poems go, because I too hate poems where I feel corrected or shouted at or even instructed.
Yes,
I don't like that. I don't like to be bossed by poetry. There's no real pleasure in that, I think,
no.
to be bossed by a poem. I don't think that's really what poetry ought to be doing.
No,
so yes, that's I'm very pleased to hear that, and thank you.
Another thing I wanted to just try out one of my thoughts about my own reading of you is I feel there's a kind of reciprocity that runs through your poetry, by which I mean a kind of, I suppose it's true of any significant poetry, but one's inner world is in reciprocal relationship with the outer world. And in your poems, I'm particularly thinking of poems like The Picture Window, What I Didn't Know About the World. They're a kind of, the world and the self of the poem speak for each other. So there's a reciprocity between them. In Vanishing Point, for instance, you say, sometimes I want to tell it this way, but the want to tell it just this way is only as strong as the want to tell it every other way. I was really struck by that. It's almost like that could be an epitaph, not an epitaph, because that could be a kind of...
steady on.
We've only just touched on middle age. We've got epitaphs. I'm afraid I'm older than you, so I'm probably thinking that way. But you said to me, it sort of characterizes something in you, I thought, in the poems.
Yeah, I recognize something in what you say there, in that I like a poem to be faithful to the world in some way. I don't want a poem to be so turned in on itself that it refuses the world, or that it turns its back on the world, or that it's not interested in the world. So I like the world to be in a poem. I like experience. I like human experience. One of the things that a poem is for me is a way of talking to other people gently, very gently and very speculatively. But I'm hoping that there will be something there that will be recognizable for other people, not just necessarily other middle-aged people in this account, because I am using metaphor a lot. I'm not really talking about the subject head on, but still I hope that the metaphor opens up subject matter or unlocks subject matter, as opposed to just making the poem turn in on itself or recoil from the world. So of course I want the world to be in the poem. I want human life. I want my life. I want my life I don't consider my life to be such an extraordinary thing that nobody will recognize what I'm talking about. The point of what I put about my life into the poem, because I don't put everything. So when I select what I'm going to put into the poem, the point is that I'm trying to find some kind of common ground. It's not exclusionary, I hope. So yes, it has to be faithful to the world, to the life, but then it also has to issue from a particular consciousness, which is mine. I have to express it the way that I experience it. So I'm not trying to tell big truths in the sense of big political truths or big social truths or anything like that, because I find it hard to get an imaginative purchase on those. And I think there are other forms of writing that are really good at covering subject matter like that. But for me, that's not where I want to bring the poems. That's not to say that those things don't creep into the poems, but if they sneak in covertly, slyly, if they smuggle their way into the suitcase, then I'm very happy with that. But I don't want to put the suitcase at the altar, and I'm mindful of where you're sitting now. I don't want to put the suitcase at the altar of that subject matter, because then the subject matter will just, or then the suitcase will just seem like a small inconsequential thing. And that doesn't seem fair to it.
But I mean, that's my strong sense of the poetry, and your poetry is, it should never be subservient to something. It should never be in front of the altar in a certain sense. Even this one, you know, they need to be, they are for them their own value, aren't they? They're not a way in which one expresses opinion and so on, and they're never subservient to something.
I think so, and because if you put something in front of the altar, as it were, then you are dictating the tone of it. You are saying that it, you know. So if putting the poem in front of subject matter that is woeful or that is catastrophic, then you close down the possibility of being anything other than earnest and serious and so on. You know, you close down the possibility of glibness and humor, and because they're not appropriate, and that's okay. But I don't think those choices should be made ahead of the poem starting out. I think they might be choices that the poem eventually makes for itself, but I think the problem there is that these are defining positions from the get-go, and I don't think that's very interesting for the poem or indeed for the reader.
I'd love to talk to you more, but we'd better start to move on, because we'll be coming back to a reading of your later on. I took the liberty of choosing a poem for each of our readers this evening, which is quite a liberty to take, I think. I wrote to Vona, I wrote to Elaine, and I wrote to John saying, here's the one I'd like you to read at the end of our interview, which is a bit naughty. But I thought I wanted you to read the poem that starts your collection, Double Negative. No one uses doilies anymore, because for me, it's just such a good instant of a poem. It seemed self-sustaining. I mean, who is it that says the poems are a little machine for remembering themselves? I think it's Don Patterson.
Don Patterson, yeah.
Yeah, I thought this was a really good example of a poem that just sort of self-standing. You don't need to do anything about you. You don't need to know anything outside the poem. You've got a lovely self-standing poem that also seemed to me to be about poetry. I don't know whether you would agree.
Definitely, and it was designed that way. But there is one thing that I would take issue with there, which is I think there is one thing that you need to know to understand the poem, and that thing is what a doily is. And I realized that actually not everybody does know what a doily is.
Really?
Yeah, younger people. Younger people who do arts and crafts know what a doily is because they use them to make Christmas snowflakes and so on. But, you know, they don't really get used very much in the context of which I describe in this poem, you know, for good use. I'm not sure good use is even a thing anymore.
No, indeed.
But of course, good use, that's language in a poem is for good use, as opposed to the language we use for making insurance claims and so on. No one uses doilies anymore. So why do I hold the word to the window? So the holes in the pattern are years ago and a visitor has come. Impossible to talk of the mart or Qatar, as though days, clumps and clods of them could be glamoured by a paper doily placed nicely on a plate. Here, so, for this poem only, is its wheel of stars and star-shaped flowers, an inkling of words as ornament, the way stars and, yes, flowers are.
Lovely. Thank you, David. Thank you very much. Thank you. That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Vona. And we'll be hearing from, Vona will be reading more of her poems just later on. But now I'm going to turn to John McAuliffe. Are you here, John?
Yes.
So let's see you. That's great. Oh, there you are. Good, good. So I think do we need to put two screens together? Just going to slightly, there we go. Great, that's great. Welcome, John. Really good to see you. You're tuning in from Manchester as well, aren't you?
Yes, I am. Yeah, in South Manchester. So
John, let's again, like we did with Vona. I thought rather than me giving introductions to you, I thought again we'd introduce you and you could introduce yourself to those who don't know you from this collection from the way in Montevideo. So let's pitch straight into that, I think.
Great. So this poem, Montevideo, is a version of a poem by the Franco-Uruguayan poet Jules Supervai, which I've adapted and changed its place of origin for my own. Montevideo. I was being born, and at the window passing by was the horse pulling the plough in from the brightening edge of the far field, a mosaic which tile by tile the light revealed. Who was driving it? Whoever was up woke the day with a little pop of his whip. Night's other element, an archipelago afloat above the day he had started. Walls raising themselves from the sand and cement and river gravel that had waited in them, sleeping tight. A little bit of soul, my soul, slipped by along a blue rail, a line in the sky, and another bit folded itself into a sheet of paper, under sail, adrift till it lodged under a stone, its wildness caught and settled down. The morning counted its birds, never losing its place. That sweet honeysuckle smell gave itself to the morning's blue swell. In Ireland, on the Atlantic, the air was so affable, such a tonic that the colors of the horizon came closer to see the houses we lived in. It was me being born, there where the woods almost speak. On his paths the grass grows surely, but not too quick. Underwater equally, seaweed and algae bob and wave. The wind too will fall for them, they make believe. Earth, always about to begin again its orbit, recognizes us in its atmospheric dips, feels in the wave and in its profoundest deeps, the swimmer's head, the diver's feet.
That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, again, perhaps we'll start, John, if that's all right with you. If you say a little bit about why you chose that poem in particular to introduce yourself and introduce your work.
It's a poem that I first came across in a translation by Moniza Alvi, and it's from a book of supervised translations, which she did about maybe 10 years ago. And I hadn't come across his poems before then.
No, I don't know him at all, no.
And I just fell in love with the book. And then I have school French, so I went and started reading the French poems. And Moniza's book is a wonderful introduction, but Supervi rhymes an awful lot. And she doesn't carry across the rhymes in her poems. And I got really interested in the idea of drawing in that element of the poems in a version that I would do. And then I was really drawn as well to the idea that he often has in his poems. He has a kind of a complicated dual sense of identity. His parents, he was born in Montevideo, but to French parents. They moved back to France and he grew up there, but he left France. He was involved in the resistance and he left for Uruguay. And it was in Uruguay that he wrote, I suppose, a lot of his kind of famous mid-century poems, including this one. So there's this sort of lovely crossed over mix of different places in it, which appealed to me as an Irish poet, long resident in the UK now. But I also loved his sense of how we are born of our parents, but of places, of weather, of times of day, and in that kind of very broad sense of disparate origins feeding into his poem. And this I was born in Roscommon in the west of Ireland, but I couldn't lose Montevideo as a title. I think it's got such an amazing sound of a word. So I kept the word, but I adapted it to Roscommon, where I only lived for a few years, but the things I remembered from it, living at the edge of town. There was a tile factory outside of the town and there were the mosaics. And so there's lots of little bits and pieces that I remember from my earliest memories that snuck their way into the poem as well.
And when did you leave Roscommon?
4, so very, very young. They're really very early memories that make their way into the poem along with his. So it's a little bit of a curious mix of a poem. Yeah.
And you also bring, it took me a while to realize that you bring across the rhyme.
Yeah.
They're very soft rhyme. I actually reread it again the other day. I thought, oh, of course, it's all in rhyming couplets.
Yeah.
But they're very unobtrusive rhymes, but actually when you see them, they're all there.
Yeah. I love that about it's in the French like that as well. I must say, you know, when you work with sound like you do in poems, sometimes you get such a kick out of being able to rhyme Atlantic with tonic was something which, you know, these are just pleasures, that incidental pleasures for you when you're writing. But I do love some of that in the French, and it was a challenge and a stimulus which prompted me into making the poem again, or remaking the poem.
It creates lovely things like a pop of the whip, which I don't know, seem to express the sound so beautifully, and rhyming that with up. But let's go on to the new collection, the Kabul Olympics. This is very recent, isn't it? It's just come out, really.
Yeah, it came out in April. You know, and ordinarily I would think of that as very recent, but given what's happened over the last 8 months, it actually feels like about maybe 2,000 years ago since that book, since the book came out. It's been, you know, the book had you know, it felt very tumultuous, and there, as usual, there's a lot of excitement around you know, when you're thinking about the poems coming together in the book and the book going out and being able to take it out into the world and to places like poetryEast. But of course, it's all been on Zoom. The poems of the book have had you know, no airing outside of pretty much these four walls. So it's been a very unusual moment for the book, for a new book to come out. Yeah, so difficult.
The first thing I wanted to ask you about is the title, and I mean, I'll come to the content, but say something about the title and about the title poem even.
Sure. I think that the book is a little different to the four books before it. But one of the things that it does have in common with them is that it does have this sort of spliced together sense of different places, which I suppose I've always loved poetry, which took me away into imagined worlds or into other worlds. So I've always been really, really, it's one of the things I love about poems, and one of the things I'm after very much in my own poems. And so the Kabul Olympics fits the ways in which there are this sort of splicing together of quite local things from different parts of the world, and also this sense that we've had, or that I've had, and I think most of us have had, of being at the mercy of these larger global historical forces which have impinged so much on the day-to-day business and year-by-year business of our lives, whether that's Brexit or whether it's the pandemic or that. So that's one sense of the title. But of course, it's also there's a poem in the book called the Kabul Olympics, which it's an elegy for a student of mine who had worked in Kabul and was working on a novel about this plan to host Olympic events in Kabul before the Taliban that changed the picture in Afghanistan. And so there's this sort of very dreamy, optimistic feeling of somebody who builds this Olympic swimming pool on top of a hill in Kabul. And then, of course, that pool is drained and becomes used for very, very different purposes afterwards. So I'm trying to, I suppose, to think of these sort of imagined and more kind of optimistically imagined futures, which and it's kind of optimism which maybe belongs in the future.
I mean, that was the other thing I really noticed about Kabul Olympics, is that there's a strong sense of threat running through the collection. It's interesting that it's published, you know, in the middle of this pandemic. It's almost prescient of it. There's a poem after poem. I don't know whether this is right or this is your sense of it. I mean, it's not just that, because there are these lovely poems about the two vases. There's a beautiful poem about a blackbird. There's about a robin. But there's also this persistent sense of threat and of collapse. And like you say, that sort of haunted by the forces of history seem to be very present in these poems.
I don't think it can be otherwise here, you know, really, in the last few years. You know, like I say, I'm from Ireland. I moved to London in 2002 and Manchester in 2004. And my family and I have lived here, you know, as Vona and her family have too, at a time when Irish-British relations were at the most cordial maybe they have ever been. And it was a time when our children were my children were very able to think very positively about themselves as Irish people, and to live very happily in a kind of a relatively global, outward-looking city like Manchester. And then to have the weight of that kind of quite positive, international and cosmopolitan present moment, I guess we thought it would last. And then the Brexit referendum ripped up that sense of kind of the porousness of national boundaries, and began to confine, I guess, them in terms of their schoolyards, and us as immigrants in another country. And all of a sudden, identity began to go back to, I suppose, the kind of things that I grew up with. And so it really did feel like we had been living in a fool's paradise for 12 or 13 years here. So I think that really did feed into kind of the sense in the poems of how at the mercy these kind of individual moments and days and things that you're attached to are to these other forces. And yeah.
I mean, that the poem that I wanted to focus on is that wonderful poem, which City of Trees. You know, again, that I really, one of the things that's lovely about the collection is, you know, you get a sense of your family, your children. You get a sense of you cycling in this poem through Manchester and the old Irish pubs in Manchester. I a while ago interviewed Bernard O'Donoghue, who's poetry I rave about. He doesn't, is he? So utterly self-effacing. I'd say to him, I really like this poem, and he'd just say, well, it's very nice of you to say so. And I'd say, no, you need to say more. You know? It's such an impressive man. You know, I think he lived in, he was living in Manchester as well, wasn't he?
He actually, he moved, you know, as a 16-year-old, he moved to not far from me here at all, in Withington, and he went to school in St. Bede's, not far from here either, and he still travels up to watch Man City, or he used to, I know. And I met him one day, and it turned out that he had occasionally parked here because one of the buses for City leaves from nearby. So yeah, so
there's a wonderful connection between.
There is, yeah.
But you know, in this poem, in City of Trees, there's a sense in which I don't know whether, for me, this is a key poem. There's a sense of which you're trying to have put everything of you and your life and the force of history, in this case, a terrifying force, entering into it. But again, I was struck by what Vona was saying just earlier on. I didn't get the sense that I didn't get a sense of ideology running this poem, or kind of opinion even, just the force of history in your life as you directly experience it.
Well, it's very nice of you to say that, and that's certainly what the poem is trying to get at, and trying to get a sense of daily life, and of quite you know, mixed kind of communities, as they are in any large city, and about the way which kind of these kind of actions can change things so much, and can just change the dynamic, and force people out of those daily routines. And it is one of these poems, and we, you know, where we, you know, as poets, you're often writing and wondering what you're writing about, and then the thing arrives in which the writing can take its shape. And there were a lot of things over kind of a number of years which were able to were tributaries into the various stanzas of this poem, and the moment of the poem, because the poem, it begins at a reception I was at, kind of celebrating Maria Balshaw, who was a brilliant curator here in the city and involved in various galleries, but also in art in the community schemes, and it was celebrating the impact that art in these communities was making, about having broken down barriers between communities. And then, you know, overnight, that sort of optimism and that sense of art's some of art's capacities is kind of just completely put back in its box, you know, by an event like what happened.
I mean, I'll ask you to read it in a moment, but the other thing that struck me about it is that it wants to, there's lots of different levels of life in it. So there's you and your everyday life, which you don't want to edit out, I think. There's sort of the natural world. I love your reference to Larkin at the start. Then it also goes to civil life and society. It's so difficult to write about society without, I don't know, sounding like you're suddenly part of the government or one part of the government. But you seem to want to include communal life and civil life. It wants to range through all those levels, doesn't it, this poem?
That's right. You know, it really does. I suppose one of the things that I got very interested in Libya and Ireland as parallel, as having as Libya, its effect on Kerry, but also kind of on Ireland and Gaddafi's Libya was a very strong presence, and in all kinds of odd ways, it keeps on coming up. And then the Libyan community around here is also, you know, it's a big community. A lot of the local taxi drivers and things here would be from the Libyan community, and a few years ago, I got to know Hisham Mattar, a really brilliant Libyan writer based in London. His book, The Return, which is about the disappearance of his father and about his trying to find his way to what might have happened to him. But I loved that memoir's balance between trying to say what happened, but also trying to register the ordinary life and the effects of that disappearance on him and his family and his practice. So that was another model for how do you put these larger things into a poem without them overwhelming other elements of things that poetry can do. So will I read the poem?
Why don't you? Yeah, let's hear it.
Okay.
I really wanted to give this the main focus of our discussion, and there's lots more to talk about in the collection, John. But I was particularly wanting to give this a real focus. So let's hear the poem.
So, and it is a little bit long. The poem is City of Trees, and it's dated 22nd of May 2017, and it begins with two epigraphs. The first from Philip Larkin, their greenness is a kind of grief, and the other is Oscar Wilde, I would give Manchester back to the shepherds. And I think the only other thing that you need to know is that there are a couple of Manchester City footballers, Balotelli and Sergio Aguero, who make an appearance later in the poem. At the town hall valedictory due, the curator's art in parks, her metal tree, and the gallery's diversity get credit, which she abjures. Look is the residue of design. A quote which, around the room, sparks applause, not for herself or the line, nor of course the fact that she is heading south, but that it asks for this new order to be acknowledged and sees the city's sprawl as managed. Cycling back under the candled chestnuts, past the gallery and through the Curry Miles neon influence, its last two Irish pubs, the Clarence and the Whitworth, refitted now as a Christian cafe and a chrome and glass shisha bar. The crowd is nothing on the night 20,000 Libyans gathered at the southern end, celebrating the death of Gaddafi, hours after it was announced on the BBC, whose old beehive building they'd camped beside in protests for months. Fireworks, flags, biscuit tin drums and gunshots, a party for the ages, like that afternoon on the allotment, digging in the spuds when the neighborly encore of cheers rolled in, Aguero going global on the end of Balotelli's flick. City going wild, submerging in its element those who'd once thought otherwise. Mental. By the time I got home, the news had pictures, a roadblock, ambulances and squad cars pulled up outside the arena. Overnight, it was first numbers, then names, and the council leader on the town hall steps, in the same shirt I'd seen him in 12 hours earlier, and the mayor taking the microphone to promise business as usual, and not exactly steely line he would repeat. Likewise, the city will not be divided and goes from strength to strength. A man is arrested outside the Morrisons in Chorlton. A door is blown in Fallowfield. Where the Lebo cargo van would park, white police trucks mark the corners. At a concert, I dismantled the book bag I've lugged from work while the metal detector queue slows and meanders. The summer nights demand updates. We write to friends about our kids. The schools stay open as they process classmates' tales of sleeping in a hotel overnight. The footage of a man with luggage on wheels buying bits and pieces in a corner shop circulates. This watchful ex-student, born here, ill at ease, walking through the May weeks of the trees' slow green explosions, the air thick with willow, pollen, and honeysuckle, all invisible in the grayscale's pixel rendering of the place, scrambling it even as the crowds gather elsewhere, in shops and bars and streets, to shoot the breeze, watch a match on telly and follow their phones, as I do, student of uprootings and aftermath, hemmed in by the information which descends on us like summer rain, the stories and images as much a distraction as each attempt to make it all align, the sequence getting out of order, which would track us as we move on from the rooms and fields and trees of the city's 100 towns, whose separating griefs harden and endure.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. And thank you, John, for reading that wonderful, really wonderful poem. We'll be hearing more of poems from the Kabul Olympics in the second half. So now we're going to come finally to Elaine Nicunhein. Are you there, Elaine? Let's see whether we can.
I'm there, but I think you have to switch on my video.
We have to switch on Elaine's video. We will
it's okay,
do.
You've done it. Somebody has done it.
At the moment, you're sort of a disembodied voice, but you'll appear in any second, I'm sure.
Am I here? Okay, can you see me?
I can't see you yet. There you are. Oh, that's great.
I see.
That's great. So welcome to Poetry. It's really lovely to meet you, Elaine. So again, I've asked each poet to read a poem that they thought particularly sort of said something that introduced you. So perhaps you'll say something about the poem that you've chosen, and then read your poem, Hofstadter Serenade.
Hofstadter, yes. I'll say something about this. I had a younger sister who died in 1990. And I found, although I was able to write poetry during her illness, I found after she died, it was very, very difficult to write anything about her or her loss. And so the poem is, to some extent, it's about that difficulty. It's about how long it can take to be able to, I won't say to see something in perspective or to come to terms with it, because I haven't done that, but rather to find some words about it. So she was a professional violinist, and the poem is partly about the decision that a young musician sometimes has to make, probably when they're too young to know what it involves, to devote themselves to that sort, to devote themselves to art, I suppose. So Hofstadter's Serenade for Morandi Ní Chuilleanáin, 1944, 1990. I felt the draft just now as I was keying in the numbers, the date of her death, going on 25 years ago. It is May, but the bright evening is turning colder. The tight bundle of grief has opened out and spread wide across these years she knows nothing of. And if I go in search of her, I must unwind and stretch out the thread she left us, so it twines like a long devious border, turning between the music stands, over and under the kettle drums and the big bass lying on its side. But it plunges away, leaving the concert hall behind, and catches her at the start, in the year she was 11, when it first rose out of her, that pure line of sound that grows, rising, dipping, never landing twice on the same spot, then catching its breath, and then flowing along as even as her own breathing, smooth like a weaver's thread, back and forth tracing. It weaves and it hops again. The arched finger nails down the note, but it overflows. She was 11 years old. 1,000 years before, she could have been married to an emperor. She was sure she was able to consent on the spot as the notes wrapped around her, and she went on playing as her eyes opened. Like words, like the long serpent that can only swim upstream, like time, the line drew her along, the string and the bow, towards the moment I saw the breath leaving her body, and the silence began.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Elaine. Yes, the reading your poem. You just published. I must say before I start saying anything more, you've just published your collected poems, haven't you?
Yes.
It feels like not just hot off the press, but this week or last week.
It's hard to say, but I think probably last week.
Right. It was a remarkable moment. I mean, the first thing I wanted to talk to you about your poems, Elaine, is the religious sense that pervades them. As soon as one looks into these poems, and the deeper I look into them, the more I'm struck by the religious sense that that perfumes, that it elevates, that deepens these poems. I wonder whether we might start our brief conversation by saying something about that.
I grew up at a time when Ireland was pervaded by religion, by customs and ceremonies and relationships, many of which have vanished, but not all. And it seemed so pervasive everywhere. But in my family, as it happens, the women that I knew were, apart from my mother, were all very devoted to religion, and 3 of them were nuns. And that seemed to create a climate of expectation that this was what the very best thing you could possibly be. And while as a child and as a young person, I was very clear in my head that that was not what I wanted to do, I found that it created an atmosphere which was terribly important, especially when I came to start to write poetry.
And is there a question here of your own faith? Are these poems an expression for you of faith?
Well, I would describe myself as a Christian belonging to a Catholic tradition, with some distance from many aspects of that. I would think that the other thing is that as an academic, I spent a lot of my life, first of all, avoiding anything to do with creative writing, and secondly, studying the Reformation, which brought me very close to certain other Christian traditions and made me think about why they're all so different from each other. And I think it's possibly quite a fertile thing where you feel very close to something, but also very distant from it, because there's something that I was really never a part of, which was the sort of basic folk Catholicism of my childhood. And there's the fact that I can never leave it alone, that I have to keep on going back and finding out more about it.
I mean, the other thing, you know, one expression of that is so many poems about nuns,
Yes.
all of which, frankly, I loved. Actually, every time we in your poems where we meet a nun, I don't know what, but I'm immediately, I don't know, fascinated, deepened. There seems to be, by the religious sense, I think I mean a sort of sense of life's deep seriousness. Its fragility, its possibilities of some redeeming experience. Don't know whether that chimes with you or whether that just sounds.
I don't know. I recently asked myself from time to time, what is it we're trying to be redeemed from? Although sometimes when you look around you, that's not too hard to answer. What interested me, I suppose, about the nuns especially, was that they seemed to have cracked a particular problem, which is when you've made up your mind about one thing in your life, it can be liberating. It provides you with your own perspective on life, which comes from that decision, that sense of what I ought to be doing. And that has always attracted me as a subject.
And how did you start writing yourself? You say that you sort of had a sense that a religious vocation was the best thing you could do. Somehow I sense that for you, poetry is the best thing you could do. How did you get there, sort of thing?
Well, as I said, the person who didn't buy into the nun cult, so to speak, was my mother, and she was a writer. So the very fact that there was somebody in the house who was doing it made it perfectly clear that you could do it. And the other thing, I suppose, I talked about my sister's premature decision to become a musician. I think I probably made a premature decision to become a poet because I could see what my mother was doing, but everybody said poetry was more difficult. So I thought, well, I'll do that. These things are, they go right back probably before your birth to things that were decided long before you knew about them.
Indeed. And what was it particular? Was it particular reading or particular teachers that nurtured that sense of wanting to do the difficult thing?
Let me think. Teachers, I think most of my teachers were inclined to say, for God's sake, stop writing poetry and do something serious. I think there was a sense that you should be trying to do something difficult, all right, that some things appeared, because I learned to read when I very early, and things which other people found difficult, I got this notion of myself as somebody who didn't have difficulties. Now I've spent the intervening over 70 years discovering that this is very far from the truth. I started off with a very strong sense that difficulties were there to be conquered.
The other elements of, I again see family. I love. I'm sorry, I can't remember the title. The Bend in the Road.
Oh yes.
This beautiful poem about your son. It's just, it seems to me, I keep coming back to this religious sense, which is, I'm struck that you're talking about a Catholic sort of folklore, that sense of being, that place is so important, and that place and the voice of the poet sort of arise together almost.
Yes, I'm very drawn to poets who write about place. And I am I grew up in a city of Cork, which is perfectly sure, still I think, that it is the center of the known universe. That you would not go anywhere else if you could help it. And I'm very drawn to people who have that sense of, I mean, I suppose I have something. That's one of the reasons why I'm so drawn to the city of Rome. There's probably one or two other places on the planet that I might have the same feeling about. The feeling that place is a series of interlocking spaces, perhaps. So that when I go back to Cork, I'm on the street, but I feel as if I was indoors somehow. I feel that I'm being contained inside something. One of my reasons for writing about nuns is because of their particular relationship to place and space. My friend Margaret Mccarten, who was a 90-year-old Dominican nun who died last month, at her funeral, people were remembering that when she was actually a member of an enclosed order, which later became unenclosed, at one time, people actually drove her past the house and told the children to stand outside so that they could see her actually out and about. And this struck me as very striking, that there are people who can live inside something, but can also be very free. I'm finding it very useful at the moment because of the locked in some of the time. But it also struck me when I was thinking about all that, that very many of my relations had also been in jail during the Black and Tan War, so that I had something of the same feeling about that this was probably something one would have to do during one's life. You know, it seemed to be part of adult experience. I haven't been inside yet, and I have visited lots of jails, but I haven't actually been a resident.
I hope not. But I mean, I'd love to talk more, but perhaps we ought to draw our conversation here just to a close, and we'll be hearing more from you in a moment. But yes, I wanted to, I made this outrageous thing of choosing a poem of yours that I'd like you to read. Actually, I was torn between a few, but the one I've gone for is She Was at the Haymaking. Another poem about a nun. I found it, I don't know, one of those poems. It was just so poignant that, you know, this experience has never happened to me and won't happen to me, I don't think. And yet it seems to touch something that's happened to all of us. Separation and love and family and leaving place for an unknown place. I don't know, it seemed to touch something that it's almost as if it did happen to me, actually, when I read it. You know, that's what a poem does at its best, doesn't it? It speaks to you. You start to feel like, yes, that happened to me too. I know exactly what you mean. So perhaps if I can ask you to finish by reading that poem.
The person I've just mentioned, Margaret Mccarten, told me this story, and she told me that it was true. So she was at the haymaking. She was down in the small field, turning the last swathes of hay on the slope facing the river mouth. Each time she came back up, she saw the wave so gently courting the land with shallow pushes, and the curved edge of the tide making its way upstream. She was alone in the field. They were up in the house with Mary, whose bag was packed, waiting for the car to bring her on the first stage, the start of her long journey, away to the far shores of America and the novitiate. She worked on with the rake, thinking of the rolling wave, an eye watching for the car. When she heard it on the road, she brought the rake up with her on the steep path to the house. They were all there in the parlor, Mary sitting in the middle, her face amazed. I can't go. Now that it's time, I can't go. Her parents said nothing. Her sister had come to bid her goodbye. Now she said, so I'll go. She shook a small bit of hay out of her hair. She washed her hands. She took up the bag and went off with the driver to a house full of rules, so far away that when she wrote to say she was happy, the letter took 3 weeks crossing the sea.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Elaine. Thank you very much. Thank you, the three of you. So we're going to have a short break now. David's going to play for us. So what I would suggest is this is a good time to do anything you need to do, go to the loo, get yourself a cup of tea. And then in the second half, our three poets from the Gallery Press are going to read their poems. But just to warm us up from that, we'll hear some more from David. That's great, David. Thank you very much. Thank you, David Breen. He lives in my community above the London Buddhist Centre, and quite often when I'm writing my emails, you hear those sounds coming through the wall. So really nice. Thank you very much, David. So now we're going to hear more from Vona Groarke, John McAuliffe, and Elaine Ní Chuilleanáin. Pronunciations of which I seem to stumble with every time I do it. As soon as I worry about a pronunciation, I seem to get it even more wrong. So I'm not going to say much about them. I'm just going to really recommend anyone to buy these. I've been reading these three collections and more for the last wee while, and just enjoying them so much and finding in them so much to enjoy. And as I said, with Vona's work and with all three work, no one's trying to improve you, try to better you, try to lecture you, but trying to speak to you. Auden famously said, didn't he, that poetry is memorable speech. It's the simplest, clearest, short definition of poetry that I know, memorable speech, 2 words. And all three poets that you're going to be hearing just now are examples of memorable speech. So I'm going to hand over now to Vona, and then we'll have a little bit, again, a moment of music, and then straight from there, we'll go to John, and then straight from there to Elaine. So over to you, Vona.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to read 5 poems, which I think should take us somewhere close to the 10 minutes you've asked me to read for. Just to give you the heads up, really, 5 poems, so you're not about to jump off the balcony after 3 thinking it's going to go on forever. I'm going to read 3 of these against poems and 2 poems then that are not against, which might mean that they're for. I'm not quite sure. The first one is Against Disappointment. I should say that all of the against poems have 2-word titles. The first word is against and the second word is a negative abstract noun. So in the scheme of things, I suppose I'm trying to propose a positive take on things that are normally not associated with positivity. Against disappointment. The pigeon that ousted the missel thrush on my will. Against disappointment. The pigeon that ousted the missel thrush on my winter balcony, who dropped me runs of speckled song in return for handfuls of crumbs. This pigeon, for all my knocking and shooing, thinks he owns the place. He's waiting for me to live out bread, and I'm waiting for him to be a missel thrush. That's the way of it these days. I could crack the code if I knew what it meant, but what would I do then? Against anxiety. We all know those cartoons, well, at least I grew up on these cartoons where there's always a chase involved and there's usually at least one animal, and there's always a bemused and rather bewildered human who inevitably comes a cropper. So that's the sort of reference field behind this poem. Against anxiety. A cartoon rider on a horse so real, it shits and stalls and rears against the rider it's been saddled with in this narrative, who wonders, of course, if he's been here before, but nobody, not the old timer in the sun chair, nor the woman stock still in her parked car, not even the dog that stares him down, bids him time of day. The horse comes not to care. There will be hay, or else there won't. Either way, he's a horse still tomorrow. The rider knows nothing about tomorrow. He moves on, colour and storyline, to the next bit of road, and the next, past fury, exhaustion, and bafflement, as he drags with his ears a shaft of light from a moon he thinks is real. I suppose that's the thing about cartoons. Everyone sees the punchline coming, except the one who's about to get punched. And the third of these against poems is Against Melancholy. So let me just find that one. I think to understand this poem, you need to have watched a dog after the dog has been washed, and you'll know that when a dog is trying to dry itself off, it starts with the head, with that wriggle thing, and it moves all the way like an eel. That wriggle moves all the way down to the tail. And I spent so long trying to work out how I could enact that wriggling, that kind of spasm that dogs do. And it just seemed to me like the most important thing in the world that needed to happen was that I would find a way of expressing that wriggle, that spasm in language. It couldn't be just wriggling, because it doesn't just wriggle, it's something else. So I changed the word wriggling, and you'll hear what I do with it. Initially, I wanted it to be a much longer corruption of the repeated sounds, but you'll hear what I eventually settled on. I think it's important to have some against mechanisms to draw on, especially in these times. And the sight of a dog drying itself off after a bath or a shower seems to me like a pretty good against all this nonsense that we have to live with now. Against melancholy. Such a storm to have me by the throat. Well, it's not as if I went looking for it, or, honestly, put much store by its antics, all those camera-ready tricks. So I changed the bed linen for the turquoise set. Imagine I'm wearing a sky blue dress and the sun has come down off its high horse and my friends are waiting for me. There now. Seems I stared it down. Let the evening shake itself dry like a dog, so the tail is the last thing regiggling, as of course you knew it would be. I mentioned in the earlier conversation about narrative and about trying to mess with the kind of a straight through line of narrative and trying to interrupt that and make it fold back on itself and knot itself up at times. And most narrative, well, some narrative will run on a line that takes you from A to Z. So this poem has that title, but as you might anticipate from what I've just said, it doesn't move in that kind of linear direction at all. Instead, I think it's probably fairer to say it challenges the idea of how narrative might work in a poem and how you might tell a story and how you might get from here to there. A to Z. Say one thing, and straight away the opposite hoves into view. This is why perhaps I am indefinite, something to do with being Libran or being short, and therefore always riddled with comparative fact. Connections go over my head or slip through my hands, or I stow them away at the back of my mind, where knowing what to do with them next is a matter of perspective and, yes, scale. We are so small. We put tins in cupboards and we take them out again. We forget to eat, we love, we only wish we could. But if there's a me and also a we, then there must be a you. There you are, one shoelace open, on a bench in a park with a breathtaking view, as you imagine me into your hand. And there I am, cupped as a hailstone or a hailstone's worth of rain, until this is a story, then an anecdote, then not even that. And I'm going to finish with a poem called As If Anything Could. I love these little sort of ready-made phrases that you pick up on it and you kind of mentally bookmark and you think, oh, there's so much kind of give in it. There's so much possibility in a phrase like that. And this is one that always occurs at the end of a phrase. You say something and then you say as if anything could. But I thought, well, I'll stick it as a title and then I'll write from there. So I'll write into the silence that usually follows after the phrase. And I'll make the poem. It's only a short poem and it's the one that I will finish with. As if anything could. A paper from the year before last is the start of my tonight fire. Where was I? What have I done? It's not as if the world was shouting, do this or do this at me. And it's not as if learning one thing means unlearning one thing else. Home is to lie when you need to lie, a bowl of tomorrow left by the bed, and a window at the height of your hand to open like a diary, so the days and all their equipage slip lightly, oh so lightly, from the room.
So now, John. Thank you, David.
Hello again, everybody. I'm going to begin by reading one of the poems from the Kabul Olympics, and it's a poem about a bird. It's a poem called The Blackbird, and it feels I should be writing about a song following up on that tune. So here's The Blackbird. The day's white internal door opens onto a kitchen full of what's been before. The kettle steaming up the radio, phone chirps, clatter of spoons, fridge hum, the order of things surviving my wakeful nighttime reckonings. Each hour hard to pin down as a handful of water. Each morning, each year echoing another I am slow to recognize. And then between the pips, there is the air's stillness into which a blackbird submits the sweetest single high and overlaying sound a minute admits, rising away as I slope out of the morning to the end of its ropey going hope, a creature of its mid-air qualms, its clustered notes and afterthoughts and here I ams. And I'm going to read the title poem of the book now, The Kabul Olympics, which is an elegy for a friend and student of mine here in Manchester, Caroline Chisholm. And Caroline worked in Kabul and she was writing a novel which involved visiting the jungle refugee camp in Calais. And she was trying to tell the story of refugees making their way from Kabul through Europe and to the UK. And as part of it, she was swimming the channel. And when she was training in her swim, she fell ill, couldn't move out of the water, and ended up being diagnosed with a very aggressive tumor. And she died really, really quickly. She was a young woman and a really talented writer. And this book tries to remember her and also the kinds of stories that she was committed to telling herself, to telling in her own work as a writer. So the Kabul Olympics in memory of Caroline Chisholm. She decided on swimming the channel to think through the chances of a character escaping the camps in Calais. When the weather turned, the organizer had to cancel, but training in the murky Dover water was not all beside the point. Swimming Pool Hill would be the name of the novel. The hill was where a swimming pool had been, built by a Russian, dreaming up an Olympics in Kabul before the rise of the Taliban. She lived with story. She added one word to another to make more probable what ought to happen. The unfinished novels were visitations, chances we should take. While she wrote, we listened, friends piling now out of the slow black car. When the weather turned, she knew what it meant. She had terrible look is what she wouldn't say. Her laugh had started at the back of her throat and tilted her head. She'd call up after writing her character into the channel. Chances were she couldn't tell from day to day where she'd be living herself. Younger, she rode off on a horse. It was a white horse seen from an orchard, her amazed father diminishing on the border, is unforthcoming on the details. They didn't matter. This isn't a story. That noise is probably the wind. They drained the swimming pool at the top of the hill, a quiet spot to test for innocence. She could hear its dry echo. Something unspoken can be something known. Saying it would be another desperate matter. I feel that in the good context of where we're talking today, I'm going to read two poems. One which does involve this kind of set of online visuals that we have all become so used to over the last year, but which I suppose is something that's part of how me and my family and our extended family have stayed in touch with one another for years and years. So this poem is called The Places. And I suppose it starts off in one of these confined places and begins to dream of others. The places. But she is miles away, the laptop's elbow in front of her, the phone squirreled into her pocket, still peeping out. The places I call her from, as distant as the town to whose blue mood I return every year, with its special combinations of cloud. On the line are delicates, the rain is on the point of coming for. The river below rising and no through road. Back up. This picture defaults to a room which is not all there. Partial, screened, it is hum and glow and pings. Tired, hungry, evenings, subjunctive moods, color, questions and commands, either and or, descending from kitchen and sofa into the old woods our vanishings are lost on. The bare lawn and sudsy river. Will we go? Remember parking the car on the pier. The kettle, the moon. Come on, this will still be here. And this slightly longer poem is called Confessional. And again, in the context of where you're sitting, Maitreyabandhu, I think I'm going to read this poem because it's a sort of a found object, really. When my parents moved into the house where I spent my teens in Listowel in County Kerry, there was an old confession box had been taken from one of the old convent chapels in Asti, I think, and had ended up in the bottom of the garden and was used as a little bit of a shed. And it's something that you get so used to, you forget thinking about how strange it is to have a confession box in the corner of the garden. So this poem is called As It Must Be. It's called Confessional. And it has an epigraph. And the epigraph comes from the American poet Alan Tate. And he writes in his poem, The Swimmers, this private thing was owned by all. Somewhere else, it might have been perfect for bird watching, or writing a novel, or repairing small machines. It faced across the lawn to the drive and front door, each neighborly call visible from where I had stowed away. The old confession box, which now that I remember it, shrinks, the lawn sloping towards this not quite shed, something like a wardrobe with two wicker flanks, an arch where the central door should have been, and inside where you might expect more space, a narrow chamber and solid timber floor, too awkwardly shaped and small for the lawnmower. Ported in from a convent by the last owner, a kind of gazebo, a curiosity, home to a rake and hose, childish things, a flat ball and plastic terracotta-colored plant pots gathering dirt and, at that time, cigarette butts and burnt matches. A place to hide and to look out from. The river whispering behind its back and birds rising up into the lilac from the lawn around it. And then above and beyond, the town's crossroads and square. This bare interior, the blue and white paint peeling from the wicker, a basket weave crisscrossing the sound of the river which broadens under the concrete bridge, the salmon escaping the dragnets and cages. And this wooden box, painted blue and white and hedges adjoined to it, a sheltered upright spot, is a place I go to, a small vault with an echo of the acts of contrition and miniature blessings where the salt Atlantic wind bent trees into a row around ruins. These are places where the robin and the crow and the seagull must cohabit. Own up to that, writing down other answers to the questions that were handed on. The river is a temptation whose rough rhythms no boat negotiates, where we drown the bodies of the voices our words come from. It is a duet, two silences, here and nowhere else. An invisible orchestra waits and a mermaid conductor you can't see, who twists and smooths these shapes and shadow boxes. And I'm going to finish with a sonnet. It's a poem called Blown Away, and it's a pleasure to be to listen to the music and to hear Vona and Elaine reading their poems today. Blown Away. I tried to peg it down the tent with bamboo poles and hooks and stones and the weight of indoor furniture, a nest of tables, a Primus stove piled on the interior hem. But away it flew when the wind came, catching first on the ash, then off like a bird spiraling wildly in updrafts, as if a life that had seemed to claw down on what came within its grip, the solid ground of love and work, was not so much gripping as in the grip of, as if each old I am and I do was useless as the mud floor when it was engaged athwart, caught up now by something else, taking its shadow with it, but not this sorry assembly of upright sticks and empty hooks conjuring, not really, a tethered shape.
So now let's go to Elaine. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you. Because this is a collected poems, I'm going to start by reading a poem that's quite old. It's called Pygmalion's Image. Not only her stone face laid back, staring in the ferns, but everything the scoop of the valley contains begins to move. And beyond the horizon, the trucks beat the highway. A tree inflates gently on the curve of the hill. An insect crashes on the carved eyelid. Grass blows westward from the roots as the wind knifes under her skin and ruffles it like a book. The crisp hair is real, wriggling like snakes, a rustle of veins, tick of blood in the throat. The lines of the face tangle and catch, and a green leaf of language comes twisting out of her mouth. The second one I'm going to read goes back to what we were talking about earlier. It's about the history of nuns in Ireland. Because of the penal laws against Catholics, convents were, of course, illegal. And in this poem, I'm imagining someone who has at some stage been spying on a convent, which was disguised as a private house. It's called An Information. I returned to that narrow street where I used to stand and listen to the chat from kitchen or parlour, filtered through rotten tiles. I thought the rough walls seemed higher than before. My cheek against the stone, I noted the new door since last I'd been there. I began to count the years. To count the questions I couldn't ask now. Did you sit apart? Had you washed your hands before entering the room? Was the water laced with vinegar? What did you say when it thundered? And what did you say when you went out? So the crowds that danced at the wedding would not know your whole story. They are dancing still beside the river, and now I see her climbing towards me up the long flight of steps that winds beside the fever hospital. In her covered basket, the makings of the meal. I had never found out the certain day. And now I must not ask, where did you buy the bread? And did they guess in the shop where you got the duck eggs that you had a guest? Along the alleys, the wind whispers to me, open your hand, let it fall down, whatever you were holding. Let it lie until the day after. Let it go. Let it lie until it is blown to the river. Do not look back to see whose hand finds it or where it is hidden again when found. I've written a few poems on the subject of translation, partly because this is something that I do, but also because it's a problem. In many ways, as we all know, translation is impossible. I tried to come at this problem by imagining something I saw years and years ago in the main square in Marrakesh in Morocco, which was a scribe, a woman telling the scribe what she wanted him to write. And I imagined that he was obviously writing in Arabic and she was obviously a Berber woman. And I was imagining that there were things that she wanted to say if she's writing a letter, perhaps to her husband, who might be an emigrant in some other country. If she wants to say certain things and the scribe refuses, says they won't do. The poem is called The Words Collide. The scribe objects. You can't put it like that. I can't write that. But the client is a tough, small woman, 40 years old. She insists. She needs her letter to open out, full of pleated revolving silk and the soft lobes of her ears, where she flaunts those thin silver wires. She wants to tell her dream to the only one who will get the drift, how she saw their children lying, every one dressed out in their simple fears. They glowed, the shape of their sentence outlined in sea green. Among those beloved exiles, one sighed happy as a curtain lightened and the grammar changed and the wall showed pure white in the shape of a bird's wing. But when she whispered it to the scribe, he frowned, and she saw she had got it wrong. She had come to a place where they all spoke the one language. It rose up before her like a quay wall draped in sable weeds. He said, you can't put those words into your letter. It will weigh too heavy. It will cost too much. It will break the strap of the postman's bag. It will crack his collarbone. The bridges are all so bad now, with that weight to lift. He's bound to stumble. He'll never make it alive. In this new book of collected poems, there are a few new poems. And one of these is about music, which is a subject I keep coming back to again. It's called Intimations, and it's about the moment in a musical performance where somebody is waiting for the signal to come in. In this case, it's a singer, and she's listening to the orchestra. Intimations. The first harsh cough out of the pipes, and then a violin tuning over and over those twisting harmonies. They are clearing the way. The switching of the bow down close to the screw, each vacillating, scratching note probes into the old sore spot, patiently revisiting. No music until that painful overture. Not yet, is what they're saying, with the shiver among the strings, the bassoon vibrating, and a tread everywhere marching, getting closer now. Light on the singer. She stands ignoring a loose curl of hair blown across her neck. Her breath comes quiet, shallow inside that extravagant bodice. Not yet, the deep inhalation and the opening high note. How long to wait for the liberating glance? How long do I have? Do I seem trapped on the edge? Will I ever step away? But this is the moment she loves, even if it wears patience to listen to the flutes quavering. We want blood and arias, and the big scene in the graveyard where she rises from the tomb and sings loud enough, long enough to send them all scuttling home to silence. The last poem I'm going to read is called The Morandi Bridge. It was written, I started to write it sometime after my husband died. The event itself happened 2 months after he died. It was the collapse of the big high bridge, which went right over the whole of the city of Genova. It was a triumph of Italian engineering. And of course, the company that owned the motorway neglected to maintain it. And it had a disastrous fall in the month of August 2018. The poem is really about the difficulty when you look around for somebody to tell them what has happened and they're not there. The Morandi Bridge. Let me lean my cheek against this limestone pillar. I want to press until I feel the buzzing, the sound the world makes when it isn't going anywhere, a purr of grey transparent wings hovering in one place, a humming to itself because it needs to lie still, stay quiet and recover. And who will bring help? The noise when the bridge fell down in Geneva, the road you and I drove along slowly, heading east behind a small Fiat, packed and weighed down with people, cake and flowers for a mother-in-law who made a Sunday lunch. They were taking their time. It was lunchtime again each year when we reached the bridge, and the families were always on the move. So we'd drive along slowly those 15 minutes, high up over the factories and streets. I would tell you this news if the stones of the world could carry language. But after 8 months, the shock and the noise inside them still, They cannot move or even allow a message to pass through.
Thank you again, David, and thank you, Elaine. Thank you, John, and thank you, Vona. I'd love to hear more readings. I'd love to hear more of the poems, but we need to conclude now. But it really struck me this evening, celebrating really Irish poetry, at least beginning to. You could spend a lot of evenings celebrating Irish poetry. I didn't feel we could conclude this evening without commemorating Derek Mahan. His new collected poems is one of my treasured books. It's one of those poetry books I go back to again and again. Derek Mahan's voice is a voice that, well, is incomparable. If you don't know the poetry, anyone listening to this and who hasn't got his new collected poems, I'd really urge you to get it close to you. He died, Derek Mahan died just last month. So I'm very pleased that Peter Fallon, the editor of the Gallery Press, is joining us to read one of Derek's poems that's coming out actually in a posthumous collection, Washing Up. Peter Fallon seems to, I almost didn't believe he existed. I read so many things that reference Peter Fallon that I always thought he was a mythic being, but here he is. And I've asked him to read one of Derek's poems, and then we'll finish this poetryEast, this Irish night at poetryEast, with another air to commemorate this wonderful poet whose words will stay with us for a long time, Derek Mahan. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for hosting this evening and for the invitation to me to salute the great Derek Mahan. He died on October 2nd, and later that morning, as I was drafting the announcement of his death, I was alert to the fact that it was the same date on which another masterful writer, Brian Friel, had died 5 years previously. And by a coincidence, I had first published works by Brian Friel and Derek Mahan in 1979 and continued to publish their work for the rest of their lives. By another coincidence, on that October 2nd, I had arranged, knowing how grievously ill Derek was, to go to see him. And it was part of my plan to call to the bindery on the way and bring him copies of a book, Washing Up, which we had worked on and had printed, and which was due for publication in October. I was sensitive too to the fact that we were within 4 days of the first anniversary of Kieran Carson. And when Kieran died, I know that he was hoping that he might make it to the launch of the book that he left, a book called Still Life. So with these coincidences, I would like to read a poem from Washing Up by Derek Mahan, which is called A True Note, and it is in memory of Kieran Carson, who died on the 6th of October, 2019. Candlelight in Port Stewart, 40 odd years ago now, and your tin whistle starts the tots jigging as though instinctively they know just what to dance and how. Astonishing, as if you'd drawn from the atmosphere the mysteries circling there, spirits of field and cliff. Oh, everything had soured that wasn't already off. But your fierce rhapsody floated above Belfast like an archangel in the sky, staring down from a cloud at iron, rope, red brick, factory, and backyard, through smoky rain, dropping tears of infinite grief and promising some relief. Your skipping, fluent song tripped from a nimble tongue until the music stopped. Still life goes on. Out there, pebbles clock on the shore. Discordant details thrive in the chaos where we live, and a true note can be heard, the voice of a blackbird. Descendant of the bird noted in marginal ink by a 9th century monk, transcribing on goat skin our formal rubric. In the beginning was the word.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. And thank you, everyone. Thank you to our guests. Thank you to Elaine, to Vona, to John, to Peter Fallon, to everyone at the Gallery Press. I hope you'll all run out and buy the collections. And yeah, thank you very much, everybody. Hope to see you again soon. Bye for now.